Boa noite. Vai fazer 4 anos, dentro de dias, que começaram os protestos contra o regime de Bashar Al Assad na Síria. De lá para cá tem sido um massacre. Mais de 220 mil mortos, deslocados, refugiados, já são cerca de 4 milhões. A emergência do Estado Islâmico na Síria e no Iraque veio ainda ensombrar mais este quadro. Razão mais do que suficiente para falar com uma figura central neste processo, que dá hoje a sua primeira entrevista de sempre a um órgão de comunicação social em língua portuguesa. O presidente da Síria, Bashar Al Assad. How do you describe your country today, Mr. President?
Let me start by commenting on the number that you mentioned in your introduction about the number of victims in Syria, which is 200,000. That's been mentioned in the Western media recently. To 200 or 220,000. That number is exaggerated. Always the West has exaggerated the numbers in Syria. Actually, it's not about whether they are hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. At the end, victims are victims and killing is killing and terrorism is terrorism. Actually, it's not about being mere number presented on a graph, on a chart like spreadsheet. It's about families, lost members, lost dear ones, lost relatives. It's a human disaster we live in Syria. This crisis has affected every part of Syria, every Syrian citizen, regardless of his affiliation or allegiance. It affected his livelihood, food, medicaments, medical care, basic requirements like educations. Hundreds of hospitals were destroyed. Thousands of schools were destroyed, 10,000 or maybe hundreds of thousands of students don't go to school. All that will create the fertile habitat and good incubator for terrorism and extremism to grow. But despite all this hardship, the Syrians are determined to continue fighting terrorism, defending their country and defying hegemony.
Mr. President, anyway, Syria is not much of a country nowadays. The Syrian army does not control all the borders. You have an international coalition flying in your skies. I mean, there are on the ground different entities. Is Syria, as we have known, lost, finished?
You cannot talk about the finished Syria as long as the people are unified behind their government and their army in fighting terrorism. We still have the institution working, we still have subsidies, we still pay the salaries, we pay the salaries even in some areas under the control of the terrorists themselves. We still have the most...
So you send money to
Exactly, salaries. They are employees. They have their own salaries. We send vaccines to those areas for the children.
So you cooperate with the Islamic State?
No. We don't. We send them, and we deal with the civilians, who are the mediators with the terrorists or the militants. But at the end, all these basic requirements reach those areas. So we don't have Syria not finished, and we don't have failed states actually. But if you want to talk about something different, you mentioned in your question, which is breaching our airspace illegally by the alliance airplanes and by terrorists supported or working as proxy to regional countries
and borders.
This is a failure of the international system. This international system that's been represented by the United Nations and Security Council, and that's supposed to solve the problems and protect the sovereignty of different countries and prevent war. Actually, it has failed in doing so. So what we have now is a failed United Nations, failed to protect our international citizens, including Syria, Libya, Yemen, and in other countries.
But you also failed, the Syrian army also fails because a lot of Christians have been abducted recently in the north. So.
Yeah, actually the role of the Syrian army, like any national army, is to protect every single citizen, regardless of his affiliation, religion, sect, and so on, or ethnicities. But if you have mentioned this, I would say yes, we would like to, and we wish that the Syrian army would be able to help every Syrian since the beginning of the crisis. But the main obstacle why the Syrian army couldn't do so, and as part of this couldn't help the Christians a few days ago that's been kidnapped by ISIS, is the unlimited support that's been offered to those terrorists by the Western and regional countries.
What we have seen till now is several attempts to have a conference, peace conference, but all have failed. What we have till now is talks about talks. What can break this deadlock, Mr. President?
Do you mean in Geneva?
Geneva 1, Geneva 2, even the Russian initiative was a fiasco.
Yeah. The solution is political, but if you want to sit with somebody or with a party that doesn't influence the situation on the ground, it's going to be talk for the sake of talk. That's correct. We didn't choose the other party in Geneva. It was chosen by the West, by Turkey, by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar. It wasn't Syrian opposition that we made dialogue with. You're right, if you want to make dialogue, you have to make it with Syrian opposition, Syrian partner, Syrian people who represent Syrians in Syria, not who represent other countries. So what happened in Geneva wasn't the model that we have to follow.
But what are you saying, that is that an acceptable opposition for you, or?
Yeah, of course, any opposition that's that works for the Syrians to defend its country, represent Syrian or part of the Syrian population.
Within the framework of the Syrian state, or?
No. Any opposition who work for the Syrian people. It's not related to the state. It's not related to the government.
So you're excluding the Syrian National Coalition?
I don't exclude anyone as long as he's Syrian. I'm talking about criteria. Anyone or any party who meet with this criteria, we can consider him as opposition. If the coalition is formed in the West or in any other country, it's not considered Syrian. It doesn't represent the Syrian people. The Syrian people won't accept him.
But are you able to discuss with them or not?
Yeah, actually what we have followed since the beginning of the crisis, we didn't leave any stone unturned. We tried every possible solution in order not to allow anyone to say if they didn't go, if they didn't do this, that would have happened. So we discussed even with the coalition, although we know in advance that he doesn't represent Syrians, he represents the countries that formed him. And second, he doesn't have any influence on the ground in Syria, even with the militants, even with the terrorists, even with anyone who is involved in the problem within Syria.
So you're saying that the Free Syrian Army doesn't have influence on the ground, that only Nusra and Islamic States have influence on the ground?
Even Obama said that. He said the moderate opposition is a fantasy. Most of the world now knows what they called it, moderate opposition. They called it Free Syrian Army or any. You have so many other names. All of them is fantasy. Actually, who's controlling the terrorism arena in Syria are either ISIS or al-Nusra mainly, and some other smaller factions.
So in the end, the solution for Syria is a military solution and not a negotiated peace?
No, actually, what we have been doing recently, as long as we don't have party to make negotiations with who can influence the militants on the ground, we went to make reconciliation with the militants in some areas. And that worked. And this is a very realistic political solution. Actually, that's how you exclude the military solution, by discussing with them and making a safe area.
All about the discussions. You had the Geneva 1, Geneva 2, the Russian initiative. In all of that, there are not, how shall I say, things in common. Is there anything, any issue that you know that it's possible? Why don't you start with them? Is there anything in common between you and them?
Yeah, if you want to talk about what happened in Moscow is different from what happened in Geneva, because they invited some of the opposition, because you cannot talk about one opposition. You have many different oppositions. You don't put them in one basket. You have some of them represent Syrians, some of them they don't represent anyone, and so on. So we have common things with some of the opposition that were invited to Moscow. So, but this is just the beginning of a dialogue. The dialogue may take a long time, but at the end, if you want to not to talk about dialogue, to talk about the end results on the ground, the question is, who of those parties, well, that we call them opposition, who of them represent Syrian people and can influence the militants on the ground in order to save Syrian bloods? That's the question. We don't have answer yet, because They have to prove. We don't have to prove. We know we have our army. The army will obey the government. If the government gives order, he will follow these orders. But what about the others? Who's going to control the terrorists? That's the question.
You pointed out that some countries, like France, don't want the peace conference to succeed. Why is that?
Actually, you have two points or two reasons, let's say. First one, not related only to the French. It's related to every official who was complicit and involved in the propaganda and the aggression against Syria during the last 4 years. It's about the end of this war will unmask those officials in front of their public opinions. In a country where there's public opinion, I don't mean Saudi Arabia and Qatar, where there's no public opinion anyway, but generally they will be unmasked about the question, whether the revolution that you mentioned, that you talked about, how could a revolution collapse or fail if you have the support of the West, the support of regional country, all this money and armament and so on, and he will support that he's the dictator who's killing his good people. So the people are against him, the regional country against him, and the West is against him, and he succeeded. It's one of two options. You're either lying to us, or you are talking about Superman, because you don't have Superman. He's a regular president. It means he could withstand 4 years only because he had the public support. Doesn't mean full public support or 100% or absolute public support, but definitely has support from large amount of the Syrian people. So this is a lie that the public opinion in the West and in other countries will ask the official about. What about the Arab Spring that turned out to be, instead of budding flowers, blood and killing and destruction? Is that the spring that you talked about? This is one reason. The other reason is more specific toward France, but not limited, but more specific, let's say. It's about the financial relation between France and the Gulf states. Maybe because they have financial difficulties, I don't know why, but this financial relation, and I don't have any proof whether this is about the vested interest about some officials in France or it's about public interest. I don't have any proof, but at the end, these interests, financial interests, push those officials in France to exchange their values of liberty and fraternity and democracy, all the things that they used to preach. They exchange those values for petrodollars. So now, those French officials and some others in the West, they don't practice what they preach anymore.
But the tide seems to change a little bit. You had French MPs here. It was an organized visit, or it came as a surprise to you?
No, it wasn't a surprise, because it wasn't the first delegation to come to Syria. But by different
French delegation?
French and other countries. Different kind of delegations, activists, mediators. Some officials came to deal with us under the table, not publicly.
But this one was organized with your government?
Yeah. It was officially organized, and they had a schedule, and they came. It was prepared weeks before the visit. It wasn't a surprise.
With the diplomatic French diplomats, or as well, or not?
We had the impression, and it's a strong impression, that most of the government, the main officials in the government, they know about it in advance, and they didn't oppose.
So, did they send you any message?
No, there wasn't a message, and they came to see the reality on the ground. And I think that's a reflection, not of this delegation. The delegation that came to Syria recently from different countries, especially in the West, is a reflection of don't taking in with the narrative, an insidious narrative about Syria and in the West by the official. They want to know the truth. About I mean, it's a kind of suspicion about the whole propaganda in the West.
So in a sense, the tide is changing, because probably there are some people thinking that even though it's a bad solution, it's better to deal with Bashar Al Assad than to deal with the worst solution, which is going to be the Islamic State.
I don't think the general public think about the second part. It's about the first part, about what's happening and how everything we said in Syria at the beginning of the crisis used to say later. They said it's peaceful, we say it's not peaceful. They've been killing those demonstrators that call them peaceful demonstrators, has killed policemen. Then it became militant. They said, yes, it's militant. We said, it's not militant, it's terrorism. They say, no, it's not terrorism. Then when they say it's terrorism, we say it's Al-Qaeda. They say, no, it's not. So whatever we say, they said later. That creates a lot of suspicion in the West. They want to come to understand this part. Why you are saying whatever Syria was saying at the beginning. Of course, in the West, the propagandists, whether officials or media, they added something to the real story, that Daesh and Al-Nusra was created by Assad, or it's because of his policy and so on.
But you've read a lot of jihadists from the prisons that went to Daesh, to the Islamic State.
No, that's before the crisis. They were sentenced for a few years, and when they end the sentence, they left the prison. We didn't. We never. It's a law. You have institution. You have judiciary system in Syria.
Anyway, Europe is facing more and more threats of terrorism linked to the jihadist movements. Some of them with connections here in Syria. I mean, the Al Qaeda or the Islamic State. And the question here is that: is Syria able to help the European countries fighting these threats of terrorism?
This is like a building. You cannot build a building without having the foundation. So what the foundation that we need in this case? First, you need the officials in Europe to have the will to fight terrorism. This is something we don't find till this moment. Second, they need to have a prudent policies. You cannot have with arrogant, stubborn official that only adopted the egotistical policies. Third, which is very important, fighting terrorism should be a value, should become a value. It cannot be a sort of opportunism. Like if now, because you are suffering in Europe from terrorism, you're scared, you want to fight terrorism in this region. What about a few years ago? You didn't suffer.
But can you help the
Yeah, exactly. If they don't help themselves first, we cannot. If they help themselves, we are ready to help. If you build this foundation, if you have this foundation, you can go to the building. This is where you can talk about how to integrate the community in your country, how to have exchange of information with the intelligence. You have many ways. Of course we can, but you need to have the foundation in order to succeed.
Mr. President, let me quote. The Syrian people aspire more freedom, justice, human rights. They aspire to more plurality and democracy. Your foreign minister said this in the Geneva conference. Yeah. However, the state of Syria is perceived differently in the West. Till now, it's perceived as brutal, ruthless, dictatorial. And it's not just a question of image. So how is it possible to convince the people that...
Yeah, this is illogical and unrealistic. Because how can somebody who kill his people and oppress his people would be supported by the same people? How? Tell me about this contradiction. Look at it from the outside. Is it palatable? Can you understand? It doesn't.
But Mr. President, the reality is that if you allowed me to go backwards and to try to pick up...
before the crisis?
Let me just try to. You started 4 years ago with the peaceful demonstrations that were repressed. And then you are blamed, your government is blamed for a lot of allegations of human rights violations in your own ranks, repression. You have the Caesar report, a defector from the army, with photos of massacres, of torture of the opposition. You have allegations that you have used chemical weapons. You have allegations of using the barrel bombs till now. And so the human rights reports about Syria, they are not very good for you, your government, and the Syrian army.
Yeah. So you are talking about massive propaganda for 4 years. We cannot answer everyone in one interview, but I would say the demonstrations never were peaceful, because the first week we lost many of our policemen. How? How could the peaceful demonstration kill a policeman? It wasn't peaceful. So this is beginning of the lies. This is the beginning of the propaganda.
All lies all the time? 4 years of lies, Mr. President?
Exactly. That's what happened. Because how do you have ISIS? Suddenly? You don't have ISIS suddenly. You don't have armament suddenly. You don't have al-Nusra front suddenly. It's a long process. You cannot have it just in a few weeks. Suddenly everybody is talking about ISIS. We go back to our statements from the very beginning, and you can see that the evolution of the events was going in that regard from the very beginning, and we said that. But they didn't want to listen. They wanted to listen to their statements. That's why I say it's impossible to only tell lies in the West. How can you tell the truth if you don't have any embassy in this country? How can you tell the truth if you listen to Qatar and Al Jazeera that were paying the money to those terrorists?
So you blame Turkey, Qatar and Saudi Arabia for being the backbone of the jihadists.
Yeah.
You have the proofs.
Very simple. What the ideology of ISIS? What the ideology? You know what is it? It's Wahhabi ideology. Do we have it in Syria? Do we have it in Morocco or in the Western Arab world? Actually, it's existed in Saudi Arabia.
As in Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia and Qatar. This is the Wahhabi ideology. Second, Erdogan is Muslim Brotherhood. He's very staunch advocate of Muslim Brotherhood ideology, which was the first organization in the history of Islam at the beginning of the last century who promoted the violence in implementing political agenda. So you have those, and you have that's enough proof. Going back to the Western media, in the Western media and the American media in particular, they say 80% of the terrorists coming from Turkey. You have another realistic one. What you called it in your media, Kobani, which is called Ain al-Arab. It took 4 months to be liberated, in spite of the attack of the alliance. Why? Actually, similar city, the same size and the same terrain, it took with the Syrian army 2 to 3 weeks. Why? Because it was supported logistically through Turkey. It's on the border. They send them everything, armament, all kind of support. The recent event when Turkey...
But did you support the Kurds? Did the Syrian army support the Kurds? Because they are also fighting the Syrian army.
Before the issue of Kobani, before that, we did. Before Kobani, we supported the Kurds because it didn't start there. It started before. And before the alliance started supporting the Kurds, we did. We sent them armament. Of course, they're going to say no, because the Americans said, say no, and we will help you. If they say yes, the Americans will be angry. Just to take precaution about any statement they may say now that we didn't. We have all the documents about the armament that's been sent to them, beside the air raids and so on, and the bombardments and everything else.
New Syrian troops are being trained in the framework of Free Syrian Army to fight against the Islamic State. You think you will have to fight them as well?
You know, and I know, and everybody knows that those 5,000 were announced by the Americans. And this is my proof that the Western officials don't have will to fight terrorism. That's the proof. I told you, the basement, the foundation is to have the will. It means they don't have the will. If Obama said the moderate oppositions is fantasy, so who do you send the money and the armament to? Reality. You don't send it to the fantasy, you send it to the reality. And the reality are the extremists. And those 5,000 are going to be another support to those terrorists, because the same grassroots of the organization that's been supported by the West, by money and armaments, they joined ISIS with their armaments and with themselves.
2 questions to finish this interview. This is your first interview with a journalist from a Portuguese-speaking country. Do you expect anything from these countries?
I don't expect, I hope. I hope the first thing, which is very simple, just for the officials to tell their people the truth, the unbiased truth, without any preconception. Just tell your people the truth and they can be able to analyze. Second, we hope from Portugal, as part of the European EU, to look at the Czech Republic, small country, 10 million, but it was very wise in dealing with the crisis in Syria. They have their embassy. They can tell what's going on the ground, because isolationism is not a policy. When you isolate yourself, when you try to isolate a country by removing your ambassadors or closing your embassies, you isolate yourself from the reality. You shouldn't isolate yourself as Europe from reality. We hope Portugal can play that role in the EU to shift this trend that started with the Americans' administration of Bush. When they have problem with somebody or with some area, instead of being more involved, they cut their relation with it. This is not policy.
Just one last question, Mr. President. You're a key player for any possible peace deal. Don't you feel sometimes doubts, anguish with this tremendous responsibility? Don't you feel what history might say about you?
Yeah, of course. This is the most important thing that any politician or leader should think about. And it's about, first of all, about having goodwill and good intention to help your country. People will judge you by your will, by how much you are related to your country, related to your people, how much you are patriot, not a puppet or marionette that's been moved from the outside. This is the most important thing. How much you do, what the best you can do to protect your country and to protect your people.
Thank you, Mr. President, for this interview. Thank you for being with RTP.
Thank you for you.